Melody had the wide, round eyes of a frightened rabbit. She stared at me anxiously from the top of the staircase as I tried to get my bearings. Her mother hadn't even introduced us before sweeping out the door. I reached a hand down toward her in the most harmless way I could manage. "Come on down. I won't bite." The girl's mouth lifted in a shy smile, and she started down the stairs with a slow, delicate gait. It struck me funny. Most 6-year-olds would thunder down like a buffalo or slide down the long, smooth banister. Maybe she hadn't had a boy babysitter before, I reminded myself. That was the first thing some kids remarked on when they met me. I never got a ton of jobs. I knew most parents of little girls had a list of girl babysitters to go through. And by the time they got down to me, they felt like they were scraping the bottom of the barrel. Boy babysitters are suspect. "I'm Stephen." I knelt to meet her at eye level. The smile widened, but still, Melody didn't speak. "So you'll have to tell me what you want to do tonight," I said. "I'm new here, but you know all the good stuff." Sometimes kids like to take the lead. It makes them feel good to think that they're the experts on something. Melody seemed no different in that respect, at least. She grabbed my hand and hauled me into the living room. There didn't appear to be much to do there, so I flopped into a recliner and asked, "Do you have some toys or games you want to play?" Melody's face drained of color, and her staring eyes widened at me. "Oh, please don't bounce on the furniture. The Bugaboo doesn't like that." "The what?" I assumed she was making some sort of joke, but Melody's pinched little features were solemn as a tombstone. "The Bugaboo," she said. Melody reached for my hand again, and I thought it was an innocent friendliness until I felt the tremor in her cold fingers. "The Bugaboo lives in the walls," she said, siding closer. "And if you make too much noise, he'll come out." I snapped my mouth shut so hard my teeth clacked. My older brother had scared me with similar tales as a kid, and Melody was taken in as thoroughly as I had been. "Don't you believe it for a minute," I said. "Someone's just trying to scare you." The soft rabbit eyes took on a hopeful, pleading droop. "Who told you about the Bugaboo?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. I had to resort to the lip reading to understand her silent response. "Mama." The answer struck me dumb. Melody's mother was no more than a series of first impressions to me. A severe hairstyle pulled up at the corners of her face, dramatic walnut-colored eyes, a double-looped strand of multicolored stones around a long marble neck. Mrs. Chambers had hired me on a last-minute recommendation, a friend of a friend of a friend, and took no interest in the teenager stranger with whom she would be leaving her only child. She scarcely looked at me as she shrugged into a full-length raincoat. "I'll be gone until after midnight. Melody needs to be in bed by 9. No TV. My cell number's on the fridge," she said. And with that, Mrs. Chambers was gone. The woman was cold, no doubt about it. If I were being charitable, I might have said that she was just preoccupied tonight, that everyone was entitled to their bad moments, and she'd given me an unfortunate first impression. But seeing the abject terror Mrs. Chambers had inflicted on her daughter, I wasn't at all inclined towards charity. A sudden blast of thunder rocketed Melody onto my lap, where she seemed to put out roots. She had no intention of budging. Fortunately, there were a few books arranged tidily in the basket next to the chair, and I plucked one at random and asked if she'd like to hear it. "That's fine," she said. It wasn't enthusiasm, but at least it was something. I didn't think she'd listen, but I read to her about garden fairies, lost puppies, and friendly frogs, until we'd worked our way through every book in reach. "Do you want me to get some more?" Melody shook her head against my chest. She seemed perfectly content to sit there all night, letting me stroke her hair while my legs went numb. As we rocked, Melody found her voice. She listed for me all the things the Bugaboo didn't like. Loud laughter, skipping in the hall, eating anywhere but in the dining room. So many things would raise the Bugaboo's ire. "What does the Bugaboo do when he comes out of the walls?" I asked. "He punishes you," Melody whispered, and her dark eyes darted around to all corners of the room. "Well, I'm sure your mom is just teasing you," I said, through a crueler joke I couldn't imagine. "Have you actually seen the Bugaboo?" "No, but Mama has. That surprised me. Most kids I knew would probably say that they had at least glimpsed the monster, even if it was only in their imaginations. But not Melody. Probably the Bugaboo didn't like lying. Mama talks to him at night and tells him if I've been behaving at school and acting appropriately, she explained. I'm sure you're a very good girl, I told her. I don't think you have anything to worry about. I fought down the anger in my voice. Melody's words weren't a child's words. They were parroted by a little girl who had heard them too often. If ever there was a Bugaboo, Mrs. Chambers was it. A roll of thunder crashed over the house, and Melody started again, cracking her skull against my jaw. I don't like thunder, she said. I noticed. Eventually, the storm faded, and I told her I'd make us some microwave popcorn to eat in the dining room, of course. Melody waited patiently at a small side table, silently admiring a single orchid in an expensive-looking blue and white pot. While I watched the bag expand in the microwave, the bag was nearly finished when three things happened simultaneously. There was a clap of thunder, a squawk of surprise, and the ominous shattering of some fragile object. I whirled to see Melody, cringing in a spray of dirt and porcelain. The orchid lay naked on the floor at her feet. Melody hunched like a rabbit, caught in flight or flight moment, just before the fox pounces and snaps her neck. Her eyes were wide and unseeing, and her head whipped left and right, trying to anticipate the arrival of the Bugaboo. Her mouth was moving, but I couldn't hear what she was saying until I was close enough to scoop her up in my arms. I didn't mean to. Melody was breathless with terror. I'm sorry. I sidestepped the mess, wary of treading in the dangerous-looking shards. There is no reason to be afraid, I said to her. I promise, there is no Bugaboo. It became a mantra over the next hour, though I had no idea if she could even understand me, for she was never so much as twitched as I held her on the chair. There is no Bugaboo, except for your mother. Melody had no more interest in popcorn and wouldn't let me put her down for an instant. I rocked her in the recliner until she fell asleep from exhausted terror. I carried her upstairs, dressed her in her nightgown, and tucked her safely away in her regulation-made bed. And I couldn't help it. I placed a little kiss just above one of her fine, soft eyebrows. Don't be afraid, I whispered to her. Sleep well. Back downstairs, I hurriedly collected the pieces of porcelain pot, swept thoroughly, and wrapped the orchid roots in a damp paper towel. Though the clock was barely ticking its way to 9, I wanted to get the job done quickly, in case Mrs. Chambers returned early. I even crushed the popcorn bag and stuffed it into the very bottom of the trash can. My stomach was in knots. I couldn't eat a bite, but I felt certain Mrs. Chambers wouldn't like to see the waste. After that, the night dragged along, and neither book nor television could ease the prickling that ran the length of my spine. I prayed that when Mrs. Chambers said no TV, she had meant it only for Melody. But I eventually gave it up. The noise irritated me. Generally, a radio or TV makes for good company. But in a house haunted by a Bugaboo, it distracts one from hearing its approach. Stupid, I told myself. You know there is no such thing as a Bugaboo. Unfortunately, reason and feeling don't always keep company. There was no restful spot in the house, and I held my breath, creeping between rooms. I eventually settled in the front parlor, a small sitting area that overlooked the leafy drive. I sank into an uncomfortable chair that gave me a full view of the room. Unfortunately, this left my back to the wall, and that's where the Bugaboo lived. Bugaboo, Bugaboo. Something was crawling in the walls, behind the high crown molding, the upper end decor, the artwork. It's Mrs. Chambers. It came from her, I told myself. She is the Bugaboo. Something bad was crawling around inside of Mrs. Chambers, behind the marble face, the velvet voice, the opaque eyes. It's her. Yet the reach of the Bugaboo went everywhere. I wanted to go upstairs to be with Melody just for the presence of another human being, but I couldn't move. My eyes were glazed. I was hyper-aware of the sound of my breath grating in and out. I just had to survive my own fear and the watchful approach and return of the Bugaboo. My heart all but stopped when the front door swung open. Had it been anyone else, I wouldn't have been glad to see another person in that house, but Mrs. Chambers didn't even greet me. She swept past the room and toward the kitchen, where her raincoat swished as she dropped it on a bar stool. I hurried in after her. What happened here? The tendons in her neck stood out against the ropes of her necklace, as she stared at the bare table. It was an accident. I couldn't choke back the stutter. Melody, Mrs. Chambers cut me off. Melody knocked it over? No, it was me. I accidentally... Don't lie to me. Her voice was an icy hiss. I'll know if you're lying. I blinked away, unable to hold her eyes. The thunder startled her. It was an accident, I explained. She didn't mean to do it. She was so scared, and this Bugaboo... A muscle was twitching beside Mrs. Chambers' mouth. I've told her over and over again to keep away from the table, she snarled, snatching several crisp bills from her clutch. Thank you for watching her. She thrust the money at me, and I hesitated. I couldn't let this woman continue to terrorize her daughter. I was glad to watch her, Mrs. Chambers, I said. She's a very good girl. Really sweet, really. You don't know. You have no idea. Whatever anger had seized her a moment before drained away before my eyes. Her voice and face were dead, and still something menacing simmered behind that rigid mask. Take the money and get out. I had no more chance of getting through to this woman than I had of soothing Melody's terror. I would have to find someone else to help me save Melody from this Bugaboo woman, if it could be done at all. I slipped the money into my coat pocket as she hurried me onto the porch. The door shut firmly behind me, like the definitive closing of a coffin lid. Driving away into the cool, drizzling night, I hated myself for my cowardice. This woman had no qualms about terrifying her daughter with monsters. What would it take to provoke her to violence? Reflecting back on her ferocious expression at the empty tabletop, and I thought I knew. Mrs. Chambers wouldn't be able to fight off whatever violence clawed at her. Not for long. Light shone from the front door's fastened window, tiny specks of illumination like the eyes of a spider, as I pulled back into the drive. I pushed the car door open just in time to hear a blood-curdling shriek from the house. It was followed by a hollow rumble like the evening's now-distant thunder. I ran up the porch steps and threw open the door. At the foot of the stairs, Mrs. Chambers lay sprawled, gaping on the shining hardwood floor. Her unseeing eyes were fixed on the ceiling, and a long string of polished stones lay in her clawed fingers. I was frozen in shock, until there came a tiny, pained sound from above me. I raised my eyes. At the top of the stairs, exactly where I had first seen her, stood Melody, her hands pressed to her face, dark eyes peeking above stubby fingers. Long red stripes rose on her legs where the nightgown didn't quite reach. I skirted her mother's body and took the stairs 3 at a time to reach her. I gathered Melody into my arms, shielded her from her mother's lifeless body, and tucked her face into my neck. Mama was chasing me, she whimpered. She hit me with the necklace. It's okay. She won't hit you now, I murmured, stroking her hair. I ran out of my bedroom to get away. I was running to the bathroom and looked back. Melody shuddered against me. Did you see your mama fall? I managed. She didn't fall. Melody's voice was a tiny sigh pressed to my neck. The Bugaboo pushed her. A blast of rain blew in from the open door, and the drops shone like beads of amber on the floor. There's no such thing as a Bugaboo, I wanted to tell her, but the words died in my throat. I called 911 on my cell and cradled Melody against me in the security of my own car until the police arrived, just in case I was wrong.